Bailiff, if she doesn't pay that fine right now, remove her from my courtroom. The words slammed through the room like a gavel before the judge even lifted his hand, sharp, final, and meant to humiliate. Every head turned at once. Pins stopped mid-sentence. A quiet murmur rippled across the gallery, as if the air itself had shifted. At the center of it all sat Jada Sterling, still as stone, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She didn't reach for her purse. She didn't argue. She didn't even blink. And somehow, that silence unsettled the room more than any protest ever could. The judge leaned forward, his robe falling in stiff folds, eyes narrowing behind thin-rimmed glasses. Ma'am, I don't repeat myself. You've wasted this court's time. That's a $5,000 penalty. Pay it now or face further consequences. His tone wasn't just authoritative. It was personal, the kind of tone reserved for someone he had already decided didn't belong. Jada folded her hands gently in her lap, her fingers resting against each other with quiet precision, like someone who had practiced restraint long before this moment. Around her, attorneys in tailored suits exchanged glances, some curious, some amused, a few uncomfortable but unwilling to say it out loud. A junior clerk near the side desk hesitated, eyes flickering between Jada and the judge, sensing something that didn't quite add up but not bold enough to interrupt. The courtroom itself felt heavier now, the polished wood benches and flags behind the bench no longer symbols of justice, but witnesses to something slipping just slightly off balance. The judge exhaled sharply, tapping his pen against the bench. What? No response. No explanation? You walk into my courtroom unprepared, you disrupt proceedings, and now you think silence is going to save you. A faint chuckle came from somewhere in the back row, quickly stifled. Jada tilted her head just a fraction, her gaze lifting to meet his, calm, steady, unshaken. There was no fear there, no urgency, just a quiet kind of awareness, like she was watching something unfold that had already been decided long before she stepped into the room. The judge misread it instantly. Let me make this simple, he continued, voice rising just enough to carry through every corner. This is not a place for games, and it's certainly not a place for people who don't understand how this system works. The word system lingered, heavy with implication. Jada inhaled slowly, the smallest movement, but it shifted something. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough that the junior clerk straightened in his chair and one of the attorneys stopped pretending to review his notes. Because in that moment, her silence stopped looking like hesitation. It started looking like control. The judge didn't notice. Or maybe he did and chose to push harder anyway. Last chance, he said, leaning back now, confident, almost impatient. Pay the fine, or I will have you removed. Jada's lips parted slightly, not in panic, not in defense, but with the quiet certainty of someone who understood exactly what was about to happen next. And still, she didn't reach for her wallet. The silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional, like a held breath no one in the courtroom realized they were sharing. And Jada Sterling finally moved, not toward her purse, not toward the clerk, but simply shifting her shoulders back as if settling deeper into her seat, as if she had nowhere else to be and no reason to rush. And that alone began to irritate the judge in a way he could not quite explain. He tapped his pen again, louder this time, a sharp staccato against polished wood that echoed farther than it should have. I am not going to sit here all afternoon, he said, voice tightening. This is not a negotiation. This is a ruling. But Jada did not respond immediately, her gaze drifting briefly across the room, taking in the faces around her, the attorneys who had already made up their minds, the clerk who looked like he wanted to speak, but did not, the bailiff standing near the aisle with a posture that suggested readiness but hesitation, and then her eyes returned to the judge, calm, measured, almost patient. Your Honor, she said finally, her voice even, clear, and controlled, not raised, not defensive, just precise. And that precision landed differently than anything else that had been said so far, because it did not carry urgency, it carried certainty. The judge leaned forward again, expecting resistance, expecting excuses, expecting anything he could shut down quickly. But what he received instead was something slower, something deliberate. Before I respond to the fine, she continued, I would like to understand the basis for it. A simple sentence, but it shifted. The tone of the room, because now it sounded less like a defendant speaking and more like someone evaluating the situation from above it. And that subtle shift did not go unnoticed by everyone, especially the junior clerk, whose brow furrowed slightly as if trying to place her voice, her cadence, something familiar but just out of reach. The judge exhaled through his nose, clearly unimpressed. The basis is that you disrupted proceedings and failed to comply with court expectations, he said. Quickly, almost dismissively, as if the explanation itself was a formality he did not feel obligated to expand on. And frankly, your attitude right now is not helping your position. A faint murmur followed that, the kind that comes from people who think they are witnessing someone dig their own hole. But Jada did not react to the tone, did not flinch at the implication. She simply nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging information rather than accepting judgment. I see, she said, and those two words carried a weight that did not match their simplicity, because they did not signal agreement. They signaled assessment. The judge leaned back again, folding his hands now, convinced he had regained control of the room. Then we are done here, he said, already preparing to move on. Either you pay the fine or you will be escorted out. And he glanced briefly toward the bailiff, a silent cue that did not go unnoticed. But before the moment could close, Jada spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just timed perfectly. And if the fine itself is issued without full consideration of standing or representation, she said, her eyes steady on his, would you still consider that ruling appropriate? The question hung there, not confrontational, not emotional, just clinical, and for the first time, the judge hesitated, not visibly to most, but enough that the rhythm of the room shifted, enough that the clerk straightened a little more, enough that one of the attorneys stopped writing. Entirely, the judge recovered quickly, or at least tried to. Are you questioning this court? He asked, his voice taking on that familiar edge of authority again. But there was something thinner underneath it now, something less certain, because the framing of her question had forced him into a position he had not anticipated, and Jada did not answer immediately. She let the silence return, not as defiance, but as space, as if giving him the opportunity to hear himself. And when she finally spoke, it was softer than before, but somehow carried further. I am asking whether the court has all the relevant information, she said. And that was when the junior clerk's eyes widened just slightly, as if a name, a memory, a headline had finally clicked into place. But he did not speak yet, not out loud, not in front of everyone. And the judge, still unaware of what was beginning to shift beneath him, dismissed it with a wave of his hand. I have everything I need, he said firmly, but now, for the first time, it sounded less like a statement of fact and more like something he needed to believe. The judge's words lingered in the air, but they no longer carried the same weight they had just moments ago, because something subtle had begun to shift, not in volume, not in movement, but in perception, and Jada Sterling felt it before anyone else said a word. The way the room leaned ever so slightly toward her now instead of away. The junior clerk, seated just below the bench, swallowed hard and glanced again at the case file in front of him, then back at Jada, then back down, as if confirming something he did not trust himself to say out loud yet, his fingers hovering over the edge of the paper like it might suddenly rearrange itself if he looked long enough. The judge, still holding on to the illusion of control, straightened his posture and spoke with renewed firmness. We are not going to delay proceedings over hypotheticals, he said, his tone sharper now, less patient. You have been given a clear directive. But even as he spoke, his eyes flickered briefly toward the clerk, catching that hesitation, that flicker of doubt, and it irritated him more than he expected. Jada noticed it too, not the glance itself, but the tension behind it, and she did not interrupt, did not rush to fill the silence. She simply allowed it to exist, because she understood something the judge did not, that once doubt enters a room like this, it does not leave quietly. One of the attorneys seated near the front row shifted in his chair, lowering his pen completely now, no longer pretending to focus on paperwork, his attention fully on the exchange unfolding in front of him, while another leaned slightly toward his colleague, whispering something too low to be heard, but clear enough in tone to signal uncertainty rather than judgment. The judge tapped his pen again, louder, faster, trying to reassert rhythm, trying to pull the room back under his command, Bailiff, he said without looking, be ready. A simple instruction, but it carried the weight of escalation, the kind that usually ended conversations rather than complicated them. Yet this time it did neither. Jada tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged, but her voice when it came was even more precise than before. Your Honor, before you proceed further, she said, not louder, not confrontational, just deliberate. I would advise a brief review of the record, and that word advise landed differently than anything else she had said so far, because it did not sound like a request, it sounded like guidance, and guidance implied authority, whether acknowledged or not. The judge let out a short, incredulous breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. Advise? He repeated, the word tasting unfamiliar in his mouth in this context. I do not take advice from individuals who have not demonstrated basic compliance with court procedure. A few quiet nods came from the back, reflexive, habitual, but they were fewer now, less certain, and the junior clerk's hesitation deepened into something else entirely, something closer to recognition. He leaned slightly toward the microphone in front of him, then stopped, pulling back as if second-guessing himself, his eyes darting once more to Jada, and this time she met his gaze directly, not with encouragement, not with pressure, just acknowledgement. And that was enough to steady him in a way he did not expect. The judge noticed the movement again, and his patience thinned further. Is there something you need to say? He snapped toward the clerk, and the sudden attention froze the young man for half a second too long, long enough for the entire room to feel it. That fragile moment where truth considers stepping forward but risks being pushed back. Jada did not look away from the clerk, her presence alone creating a kind of quiet permission. And finally, carefully, the clerk cleared his throat. Your Honor, he began, his voice measured but uncertain. There may be additional information in the system that has not been. The judge cut him off immediately, sharp and dismissive. Then pull it up, he said, waving a hand as if it were a minor inconvenience. But the interruption did not erase what had already happened. It only confirmed it, that something had been missed, something important enough to make the room pause. The clerk turned to his screen quickly, fingers moving now with a sense of urgency he had not shown before, the faint glow of the monitor reflecting in his eyes as he searched, and the seconds that followed stretched longer than they should have, not because of time, but because of expectation, because everyone in the room now felt that whatever appeared next mattered more than the fine, more than the ruling, more than the judge's authority itself. Jada remained still, composed, her hands resting exactly where they had been, but there was a quiet shift in her posture, not visible to most, just a subtle settling, like someone who knew the outcome was no longer in question, only the timing. And the judge, watching the clerk now instead of Jada, felt something unfamiliar press at the edges of his certainty, not yet doubt, not fully, but close enough to make his next breath slightly less steady than the last. The faint clicking of keys filled the silence as the junior clerk leaned closer to his monitor, his posture no longer hesitant but focused, driven by something he could not ignore anymore, and the glow from the screen sharpened the tension in his expression as lines of information began to populate faster than his breathing could keep up with. The judge shifted in his seat, impatience creeping back into his voice as he tried to regain the upper hand. Well? He demanded, tapping his pen again, though now the sound lacked the same authority it had before. If there is something relevant, state it clearly. But the clerk did not respond immediately, not because he did not hear, but because what he was seeing required a second look, a confirmation, something to ground it in certainty before it could be spoken out loud. Jada Sterling remained motionless, her gaze steady, not on the screen, not on the judge, but somewhere in between, as if she understood exactly what the clerk was processing without needing to see it herself. And around the room, the subtle shift deepened as more people leaned forward. Curiosity replacing assumption, anticipation replacing dismissal. One of the attorneys in the front row adjusted his glasses and turned slightly toward the clerk's station, his earlier confidence replaced by quiet attention, while another uncrossed his arms, his body language opening as if preparing to absorb new information rather than defend an old conclusion. The judge exhaled sharply again, louder this time, the sound cutting through the low hum of expectation. Clerk, this is not complicated, he said, voice firm but edged now with something less stable. Either there is additional information or there is not. And still, the clerk hesitated, his eyes scanning, scrolling, then stopping, then returning to a specific line as if the words themselves carried weight beyond their placement. He leaned closer, reading silently, then once more, and that pause stretched just long enough to change the energy in the room completely. Jada shifted her fingers slightly, the smallest movement, but it signaled readiness, not reaction. And when the clerk finally spoke, his voice came out quieter than expected but carried further than intended. "Your Honor," he said, and this time there was no uncertainty in his tone, only caution. "There is a professional designation attached to Ms. Sterling's record." The words landed softly, but the implication behind them rippled outward instantly. Because designation was not a casual term in this setting, it meant rank, it meant standing. It meant something that could not be ignored without consequence. The judge frowned, leaning forward again, his confidence attempting to reassemble itself. "Then read it," he said, almost dismissively, but the edge in his voice betrayed a growing discomfort he could not yet name. The clerk swallowed once, his eyes flicking briefly to Jada before returning to the screen, as if confirming that what he was about to say was not only accurate, but understood. "It indicates that she holds an executive leadership position within the state bar," he continued, choosing each word carefully. And the moment that sentence left his mouth, the room did not react loudly. It reacted quietly, but with unmistakable weight, a collective intake of breath, a stillness that replaced the earlier murmurs. One of the attorneys in the back straightened immediately, recognition flashing across his face, while another leaned forward, whispering something urgent to the person beside him, no longer dismissive but alert. The judge's expression tightened, not in anger, not yet, but in recalibration, as if the frame of the situation had shifted and he was now trying to fit himself back into it. "Executive leadership," he repeated, slower this time, the words sounding different now, heavier. "That does not change the fact that she is subject to courtroom procedure." But even as he said it, the statement felt thinner, less grounded, because the context had changed in a way he could not fully control. Jada finally lifted her chin just slightly. Her voice, when it came, was as calm as it had always been, but now it carried something more visible, not power announced, but power recognized. "Of course, Your Honor," she said, evenly. "Procedure applies to everyone." And then she paused, not for effect, not for drama, but for clarity, including those who enforce it. And that was when the room fully understood that this was no longer about a fine, no longer about compliance. It was about alignment, about authority meeting accountability, and for the first time since the gavel had metaphorically fallen at the beginning, the judge was no longer the only one holding the weight of the room's attention. The words settled into the courtroom like a quiet shift in gravity, and for the first time since the exchange began, the judge did not immediately respond, his fingers tightening slightly around the pen before he set it down altogether, as if the small object had suddenly become unnecessary, or perhaps even distracting. The room felt different now, not louder, not chaotic, but charged with a new kind of awareness, the kind that does not announce itself, but changes how every movement is perceived. And Jada Sterling could feel it in the way the attorneys no longer looked past her but at her, in the way the clerk remained still, waiting, not just for instruction but for what came next. The judge cleared his throat, attempting to restore the cadence he had lost. "An executive role within the state bar," he said slowly, carefully, as if testing the weight of each word before committing to it, "does not place anyone above this court." And while the statement was technically sound, it no longer carried the authority it was meant to reinforce, because it sounded less like a principle and more like a defense. Jada inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the point without challenging it directly. "I agree," she said, her voice even, composed. "No one is above the court." And for a brief moment, it seemed as though the balance might return to the judge, as though the structure of the room might reassemble itself around his position. But then she continued, her tone unchanged, "Which is precisely why the court must operate above bias." And that word, bias, did not land loudly, it landed precisely, like a line drawn where none had been acknowledged before. A subtle ripple moved through the room, not visible in gestures, but in stillness, in the way people stopped shifting in their seats, in the way even the quietest sounds seemed to recede as attention sharpened. The judge's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his posture adjusting again. But this time it was not to assert dominance, it was to maintain it. "Are you implying misconduct?" he asked, his voice controlled but edged, and the question itself revealed more than it concealed, because it showed that he understood the direction of the conversation even if he resisted it. Jada did not answer immediately. She let the question exist, let it settle into the same space the clerk's words had occupied, and when she finally spoke, her tone remained steady, unhurried. "I am stating that the application of authority should be consistent," she said, regardless of perception. And the word perception lingered longer than expected, because everyone in the room understood what it pointed to without her needing to say it directly. One of the attorneys in the second row leaned forward slightly, his earlier skepticism replaced by a quiet attentiveness, while another shifted his gaze toward the judge, not in defiance, but in reconsideration, as if recalibrating his understanding of the situation in real time. The judge exhaled again, slower this time, his hands now resting flat against the bench, grounding himself in the physical space as if to stabilize the intangible shift happening around him. "This court does not operate on perception," he said, more firmly now, but the statement sounded rehearsed, familiar, something he had said many times before without question, and now, for the first time, it was being heard differently. Jada's eyes did not leave his, and when she spoke again, there was no increase in volume, no change in pace, just clarity. "Then the record will reflect that," she said, and the simplicity of the statement carried a weight that expanded beyond the moment itself, because it implied documentation, accountability, permanence. The clerk's fingers hovered over the keyboard again, not typing yet, but ready, aware now that every word spoken from this point forward held a different kind of consequence. The judge glanced briefly at the clerk, then back at Jada, and in that brief exchange, something subtle but undeniable shifted. The understanding that this was no longer a contained interaction, no longer a routine exercise of authority, but something that extended beyond the room, beyond the immediate, into a system that watched, recorded, and responded. Jada adjusted her posture slightly, not in reaction, but in readiness, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm precision it had from the beginning, but now it was unmistakably grounded in position. "For clarity," she said, "my role within the state bar includes oversight of professional conduct standards," and she paused, not for emphasis, but to allow the meaning to settle fully, including judicial conduct where applicable. And that was the moment the shift completed itself, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with recognition, because the room understood now, fully, that this was no longer about whether she would pay a fine, but about whether the fine itself could withstand the scrutiny of the very authority she represented. The air in the courtroom did not move. It held, like something invisible had pressed pause on everything except thought. And for the first time since the judge had spoken with absolute certainty, he did not immediately respond. His gaze fixed on Jada Sterling, as if recalculating not just her words, but the position she now occupied within the structure he believed he controlled. The phrase judicial conduct where applicable echoed quietly in the minds of everyone present, not because it was loud, but because it was precise, and precision in a room like this carried more force than volume ever could. The judge leaned back slightly, slower this time, his movements measured in a way that suggested awareness rather than dominance, and when he spoke, his tone shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed by those paying attention. "That may be your role outside this courtroom," he said, choosing each word carefully now. "But within these walls, I maintain authority over proceedings." And the statement, while still firm, lacked the earlier edge of dismissal, because now it had to coexist with something else, something he could not simply override. Jada inclined her head once, acknowledging the structure without yielding to it, her voice, when it followed, steady and unhurried. "Authority and accountability are not separate systems, Your Honor," she said, and the simplicity of the sentence carried a layered meaning that settled deeper than any argument could, because it did not challenge his position. It reframed it. The clerk remained still, his hands no longer hovering, but resting lightly on the keyboard, as if waiting for a signal that had already been given without words. And in the gallery, the subtle shift continued. One attorney now sitting upright with a sharpened focus, another no longer whispering but watching openly, as if witnessing something that extended beyond routine procedure. The judge exhaled slowly, his fingers pressing lightly against the surface of the bench, grounding himself again, and for a brief moment, the room felt balanced on a line, so thin it could tilt in either direction depending on what came next. Jada did not rush to fill that space. She allowed it to stretch, because she understood that timing was not about speed, it was about placement, and when she finally moved, it was not toward the clerk, not toward the bench, but toward something smaller, quieter. She reached into her bag and removed her phone, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a deliberate action that drew more attention than any raised voice could have. The motion alone caused a subtle ripple, the clerk's eyes flicking toward the device, one of the attorneys shifting forward slightly, the bailiff adjusting his stance without being instructed, because something about that movement signaled transition. The judge noticed it as well, his gaze narrowing slightly. "What are you doing?" he asked, not sharply, but with a controlled curiosity that had not been present before. And Jada did not look up immediately, her fingers moving across the screen. With quiet efficiency, the glow of the display reflecting faintly against her composed expression. When she spoke, her voice was as even as it had always been, but now it carried something unmistakable, not defiance, not urgency, but execution, ensuring that the record reflects complete context. She said, and that sentence, simple as it was, landed with a weight that extended beyond the room, because it implied connection, oversight, continuity. The judge's posture stiffened slightly, not in reaction, but in recognition of what that might mean, and for the first time, he did not immediately counter, because he understood that whatever she was initiating was not confined to his immediate control. The clerk glanced at the judge, then back at Jada, then to his screen again, as if aligning himself with the flow of information rather than the direction of authority, and in that alignment, the balance of the room shifted once more, not abruptly, but definitively. Jada lifted her gaze then, meeting the judge's eyes directly, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, and she spoke one more time, her tone calm, but now unmistakably anchored in position. "The board will want clarity on how this was handled," she said, and she did not elaborate, did not explain, because she did not need to. The implication was complete on its own, and in that moment, the courtroom was no longer just a place where decisions were made. It had become a place where those decisions would be reviewed. The moment Jada Sterling said the board will want clarity on how this was handled, the room did not react with noise. It reacted with absence, the kind of silence that does not come from confusion, but from realization, and the judge felt it before he could respond. The subtle but undeniable shift where authority was no longer assumed but examined. His gaze remained fixed on her, but now there was calculation behind it, not just control, and for the first time since the exchange began, he did not immediately assert his position, because the ground beneath it no longer felt as stable as it had moments before. Jada did not look back at her phone. She did not need to. The action had already been taken. Whatever connection had been made was now outside the room, beyond the judge's reach, and that was the difference, not power claimed, but power activated. The clerk swallowed again, his eyes flicking between the judge and Jada, then back to his screen, as if the information in front of him now carried a different level of importance, not just procedural but consequential, and his fingers hovered again, ready, aware that whatever came next would need to be recorded exactly as it happened. One of the attorneys in the front row leaned back slowly, exhaling under his breath, the kind of reaction that came when someone recognized a shift too late to pretend it had not occurred, while another adjusted his tie, not out of habit, but out of discomfort, as if recalibrating his place in a room that no longer followed the script he expected. The judge finally spoke, but his voice, while still controlled, carried a different texture now, less sharp, more measured. "Ms. Sterling," he said, and even the use of her name instead of a generic address signaled the change. "This court operates independently of external influence," a statement that would have landed firmly earlier, but now felt like a line drawn in response rather than a rule declared in advance. Jada held his gaze, her expression unchanged, and when she spoke, her voice remained calm, but there was no mistaking the finality beneath it. Independence does not exempt accountability, she said, each word placed with precision, not to escalate, but to define. And that definition settled into the room with a weight that could not be ignored. The judge's jaw tightened slightly, his hands pressing flat against the bench again. But this time it was not to assert control, it was to steady himself within a structure that was no longer entirely his, and the seconds that followed stretched, not because of uncertainty, but because of inevitability. Jada shifted her posture just slightly, not forward, not back, but centered, grounded, and then she spoke again, her voice carrying the same calm authority it had from the beginning. But now it was unmistakably recognized by everyone in the room. "For the record," she said, and the phrase alone caused the clerk's fingers to lower onto the keys, ready to capture every word. "You did not find a disruptive participant," she continued, her eyes steady on the judge. "You find the acting president of the State Bar Association." And then she paused, not for effect, not for drama, but because the sentence itself required space to be understood. The impact was immediate, not in volume, but in stillness, the kind that moved through the room like a wave without sound. One attorney's pen slipping from his hand onto the bench without him noticing, another leaning forward as if the physical motion could help process what had just been said, and the clerk froze for half a second before typing again, slower now, more deliberate, as if each word carried weight beyond documentation. The judge did not speak, not immediately, because for the first time, the position he had assumed at the start of this exchange no longer aligned with the reality in front of him. And in that silence, the entire courtroom understood what had just happened, not a challenge, not an argument, but a reveal, and with it, a complete reversal of who held the true authority in the room. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and irreversible. And for a moment that felt longer than it was, no one in the courtroom moved, not the attorneys, not the clerk, not even the bailiff whose posture had shifted from readiness to uncertainty without instruction. The judge remained still behind the bench, his eyes fixed on Jada Sterling as if searching for something in her expression that might soften what had just been said. But there was nothing there except calm, measured certainty. The kind that does not rise or fall with pressure, the kind that simply remains. The silence that followed was no longer passive. It was active, filled with recalculation, with realization, with the quiet unraveling of assumptions that had been made only minutes earlier. The clerk's fingers hovered above the keyboard again, then slowly began to type, each keystroke deliberate, careful, as if the act of recording now carried weight beyond routine documentation, because this was no longer a standard proceeding. This was a moment that would be reviewed, examined, remembered. One of the attorneys in the front row leaned forward fully now, his elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the bench, no longer detached, no longer neutral, while another shifted in his seat and lowered his gaze, as if avoiding direct acknowledgement of how quickly the room had changed. The judge inhaled slowly, deeper than before, his shoulders rising slightly before settling again, and when he finally spoke, his voice was still controlled, but the tone had changed in a way that could not be disguised. "If that is the case," he said, carefully, "then this court will take a moment to review the circumstances." And the statement, simple as it was, marked a complete departure from the certainty he had projected earlier, because now it was no longer a declaration, it was an adjustment. Jada did not respond immediately. She did not need to. The shift had already occurred, and her presence, alone, steady and composed, reinforced it without a single additional word. The clerk turned slightly toward the judge, awaiting further instruction, but this time his posture was different, no longer tentative, but aligned with the process itself rather than the person directing it. The judge glanced briefly at the screen in front of him, then back at Jada, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not fear, not even hesitation, but recognition, the kind that comes when authority meets its boundary. "The fine is hereby suspended pending further review," he said, the words precise, measured, and though they were spoken with control, they carried the unmistakable weight of reversal. A quiet exhale moved through the room, not relief exactly, but release, the tension that had been building now shifting into something else, something steadier, something grounded. The bailiff adjusted his stance again, this time stepping back. Slightly, no longer positioned for action but for observation, while one of the attorneys straightened his posture and nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging the outcome without drawing attention to it. Jada remained exactly where she was, her hands resting calmly, her gaze steady, and when she finally spoke, her voice was as composed as it had been from the beginning. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, and the words were not triumphant, not sharp, just respectful, but firm. The kind of acknowledgement that did not concede anything but recognized the correction. The judge gave a slight nod in return, his movements smaller now, more contained, as if aware that every gesture carried meaning beyond itself, and for a brief moment, the room held that new balance, not the imbalance of authority misapplied, but the equilibrium of authority checked. The clerk continued typing, capturing the updated ruling, the revised record, the shift that had taken place not through confrontation, but through clarity. And as the courtroom settled into this new reality, it became clear to everyone present that what had just happened was not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, a quiet collapse of assumption followed by a precise restoration of order. And at the center of it all, Jada Sterling had not raised her voice. She had simply revealed the truth at exactly the moment it could no longer be ignored. The courtroom did not return to what it had been before it. Could not, because something fundamental had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, not by silence, not by procedure, not even by authority. And as the clerk continued to type, documenting the suspended fine and the revised record, each keystroke felt like a quiet confirmation that what had just happened was no longer a moment. It was now part of the system itself. The judge sat still behind the bench, his posture composed but no longer rigid, his hands resting flat, as if grounded not in control but in awareness. And though he did not speak immediately, his presence carried a different weight now, not diminished, but adjusted, aligned with something larger than the role he had stepped into at the beginning of the exchange. Jada Sterling remained seated, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and for a brief moment, she allowed the room to settle around her, not claiming attention, not demanding acknowledgement, simply existing within the space she had clarified. One of the attorneys in the front row slowly gathered his papers, but his movements were more deliberate than before, as if he understood that he had witnessed something that extended beyond a single case, while another glanced toward Jada with a subtle nod, not performative, not exaggerated, just recognition. The bailiff shifted again, this time fully at ease, his stance no longer prepared for intervention but for routine, as if the tension that had once filled the room had been replaced by something steadier, something grounded in clarity rather than assumption. The judge finally spoke, his voice measured, composed, and unmistakably different from where it had begun. "Miss Sterling," he said, pausing briefly as if ensuring that the words he chose would align with the moment. "This court acknowledges the importance of maintaining both procedural integrity and professional respect." And though the statement was formal, it carried a quiet sincerity that had not been present before, because it was no longer about asserting authority, it was about recognizing its proper use. Jada inclined her head slightly, accepting the statement without embellishment, and when she responded, her voice remained steady, but now it carried something deeper, not just control, but purpose. "That is all I expect, Your Honor," she said, and the simplicity of the sentence resonated more than any extended argument could have, because it defined the entire exchange in a single line. The clerk finished typing and pressed a final key, the sound soft but definitive, and then he looked up, his gaze briefly meeting Jada's, not with hesitation this time, but with understanding, as if he had learned something that would remain long after the room cleared. The judge gave a slight nod, signaling the continuation of proceedings, but the rhythm had changed, not disrupted, not broken, but refined. And as the next case began to move forward, it did so within a space that had been recalibrated. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Jada gathered her things slowly, her movements unhurried, and as she stood, there was no rush to exit, no need to assert anything further, because everything that needed to be understood had already been made clear. She turned slightly, walking down the aisle with the same quiet confidence she had entered with. But now the room watched differently, not with judgment, not with dismissal, but with awareness. And as she reached the doors, she paused. For just a fraction of a second, not to look back, not to confirm anything, but simply to exist in the moment that had just passed. Then she stepped forward and left the courtroom, the door closing softly behind her, and the sound, though quiet, marked the end of something more than a hearing. It marked the end of assumption, the end of unchecked perception, and the beginning of something far less visible but far more lasting. Because in that room, on that day, no voice had been raised, no argument had been forced, no authority had been shouted into existence. Instead, it had been revealed, precisely, calmly, and at exactly the moment it could no longer be ignored. And that was the kind of power that did not need to announce itself, because once seen, it could never be unseen.